Last but not least, framework hypothesis. I told you that framework on that early slide was going to come back. Here it is. Uh, there is, according to this view, this is significant. This view says the fact that there are these clear parallels tells us that there is something going on in Genesis 1 more than what meets the eye. And to just read it as a chronological narrative is actually to do it a disservice for what it is trying to show us. So, here's the major belief of the framework hypothesis. The days in Genesis are actually not describing literal chronological days. They are, in fact, literary devices employed by God in order to communicate the story of creation in terms that we can understand. So if you could go back with a time machine and a camcorder, you would not, according to this view, see God creating things over the course of 6 days. We don't know what it would look like. Maybe it would have taken millions of years. Maybe he did it all in an instant. We don't know, because that's not what Genesis 1 is trying to tell us. Genesis 1 isn't talking about chronological days. It's talking about a logical way of understanding the way creation works within itself and how it relates to God. All right. Why might someone believe this? What are some of the arguments for? Again, allows for commonly accepted scientific understanding of the age of the earth and the fossil record. Why not? Because the Bible isn't trying to tell us that. Now, again, it's not saying that we have to believe that. It's just that's not what the Bible is concerned with. Um, that framework, like that, there is a logic there. So whether or not it's like God created those things in that way chronologically in order for it to reflect a logical framework, or if he just had Moses write it in that way for us to see the logical framework, like you can't deny that the logical framework is there, right? I mean, light, sun, sea, fish, sky, birds, land, animals, that's there. So whether God actually created it that way or God is just writing it that way for us to see it, there is a logic there. And what's interesting is it's not just that the day one and day four is parallel, day two, day five, day three, day six, but actually the first 3 days have something in common too. Those first 3 days are all domains or they're kingdoms, um, or they're kind of places, right? And then the second 3 days are the things that fill those places or have dominion over those domains or are kings over those kingdoms. And we see that with the sun, moon, and stars. Because even though we know that the sun is, not a living sentient being, when God creates the sun, moon, and stars, he gives them instruction. He says to govern the day and the night. And so there's that clue in the text itself that's telling us there's something going on here. And then, ending with humans being made in his image. Why? So that we can have dominion over the birds and the animals. Like there's this kingship language built into the creation narrative. Um, and that, to that last point there, the theological understanding behind the days of creation, it lines up with the rest of the Bible thematically more than just the suggestion that God must have created the world in 6 24-hour consecutive days. Like nowhere else really in the Bible do we get at the, God having to have done it that way. But this idea that like God created the world and he created things to bring order to the world and then he created things to govern and maintain and control and subdue and steward and profit the world like that does line up with the rest of the text and the narrative that God is writing overall. Um, Arguments against this view. I mean, I like this view, so so it's hard for me to make a strong case against it. Here's the problems with it. Again, there's nowhere in the text that overtly tells us not to read it chronologically. And so you are kind of asking it to be interpreted in a way differently than we would interpret a lot of the rest of Genesis. And so it brings up this kind of question of like, okay, well, then at what point do you start reading Genesis literally as it literally happened? And so people who hold to this view, you have to make that decision of where you're going to kind of jump into the story and say, okay, we're no longer talking in literary devices and symbolism. You could go back with a camcorder and watch this event happen. Do you make that decision at Genesis 2? and say Adam being created from the dust and Eve being created from his rib. That literally happened in the order that it is written as a narrative. Is it Genesis 3 when they're eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and they're talking to the serpent? Or is it the global flood? Or is it actually not the global flood? Is it the Tower of Babel? Is it actually after the Tower of Babel? Like, is it when you get to Abraham? And there's kind of this perhaps slippery slope where it's like, okay, if you're not going to read the first 11 chapters of Genesis as literal history, if you're not going to read the first chapter of Genesis as literal history, what's preventing you from starting to symbologize and make metaphorical the rest of the Bible? Right? Because at some point we have to say these things literally did happen. Jesus literally lived and died and rose again. Otherwise, we're really veering into some different territory as Christians. So I do think that's a challenge to this view, is you have to come up with an interpretive stance as to, okay, if the first chapter is meant to be read logically rather than chronologically, at what point do you say, now we're looking at real history that you could go back and watch with a camcorder the way it's being described in the text? Okay, here's a summary. The days of Genesis 1 provide a logical framework for how God created rather than a chronological framework. So, we don't actually know how God created the world because that's not what Genesis 1 is about. What do we do with dinosaurs? They existed, just like the fossil record shows us. They did not overlap with humans. That's not, yeah, we don't know how they existed. We have to go to science to find that kind of stuff out. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't already, go ahead and listen to Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, which we also have on our channel. And then after you listen to it, go hear me and my husband Jonathan talk about it, because I think Galileo's thinking helps navigate some of this conversation and how science and the Bible interact.